Hello internet users, and welcome back to Lost Content, the show where I talk about neat things that I can't afford. Growing up, one of my favorite console add-ons was the Gameboy player for the Gamecube, a fun little device that allowed for Game Boy and Game Boy Advance games to be played on the TV. When it came to playing handheld games this way, the Game Boy player and Super Game Boy are probably the ones that most of us remember. Aside from those, the only thing else available was those questionable third-party products like the Game Boy Hunter. However, often forgotten about were similar devices that Nintendo had made, rare items that couldn't be found in stores, as they were never sold to the public. Allow me to introduce you to the Wide Boy. Coming before the Super Game Boy, the first Wide Boy was an interesting tool. It was made for Nintendo by Intelligent Systems, and was originally for the NES and Famicom. With it, one could play the original Game Boy cartridges on a TV, using the console's controller to play. It was only ever sold by Nintendo to software developers and press outlets such as gaming magazines. Developers would use it for testing out their games on a larger screen, which made a lot of sense. If you've got a group of people trying to gauge what works and what doesn't for a game, a TV screen is much better than everyone crowding around a single Game Boy. I'd also guess that it made presenting the software to the higher-ups and publishers much easier for similar reasons. Another benefit of the Wide Boy at the time was that it made getting footage and screenshots a much simpler task. Odds are, if you've ever looked at a picture of a Game Boy game in Nintendo Power or a strategy guide, the Wide Boy was the reason it was there. And although I couldn't find information confirming it, I think it's also likely that most TV commercials for Game Boy titles relied on this method as well. With the actual console having a tiny screen and lacking a backlight until the Game Boy Advance SP, if you were in the business, there was little alternative to getting one. But fast forward some years, after the Super Game Boy released, and before the Game Boy player. During the era of the Nintendo 64, there was no similar technology available for sale to the public. The closest thing that Nintendo gave us for the console was the Game Boy Transfer Pack, which when used with Pokemon Stadium 1 or 2, allowed for some of the main series Pokemon games to be played on the TV. That is, when it didn't err from the slightest bit of movement from the controller, but only being able to play a select few games as opposed to the handheld's entire library hardly makes this a comparable option to the other two add-ons. But even though a Nintendo 64 equivalent of the Super Game Boy had not been released to retailers, that didn't mean that Nintendo hadn't made one. Say hello to the Wide Boy 64. This newest version of the Wide Boy, like the name implies, was for the Nintendo 64 and allowed for Game Boy cartridges to be played on the TV, but the difference goes beyond just the name and console. The Wide Boy 64 was released in two models. The first was the CGB version, which was compatible with all Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. The second was the AGB version, which could play Game Boy Advance games. Just like its predecessor, the Wide Boy 64 was mainly used by developers for testing, and other outlets for gathering visual materials. Unlike its crude-looking older brother though, this one had a few more additional quirks. For one, the analog stick on the N64 controller allowed you to zoom in and out, and both models had different borders around the game while it was being played. Another curious thing is that pressing R and Z at the same time was how you activated the soft reset feature. And if you're wondering, since the Nintendo 64 lacked a select button, that function was mapped to all four of the C buttons. During the time that Nintendo was selling the Wide Boy 64, it had started to find use elsewhere. Retailers would use it for displaying upcoming or newly released games, but by far the most notable example was on the children's TV show, Video and Arcade Top 10. Yeah, how many of you fellow Canadians just got hit with a wave of nostalgia after seeing that logo again? The show featured kids playing video games, competing for prizes. For the later episodes of the show, they used Wide Boys so that Game Boy Advance games could be played and recorded on a TV. After learning of this, I actually looked up some old episodes, and sure enough, in some shots you can get a good view of the devices. In the gameplay portions, you can also partially see the border of the AGB model on the screen. It's funny, I'm only just now remembering watching the show as a kid and questioning how they were playing Game Boy Advance games on the N64. Another crazy thing about the Wide Boy 64 was its price tag. Because it was never available to the general consumer, the only way to get one was to purchase a unit directly from Nintendo, for about $1,400 US. Seems pretty pricey, doesn't it? It's especially strange since, from what I understand, the Wide Boy 64 was more or less just a Game Boy Color or Game Boy Advance crammed into a big N64 cartridge. I should also mention that all versions of the Wide Boy came with a handheld and rough-looking cord. This was meant to be connected and used to control the game, as opposed to using the controller of the console the Wide Boy was powered by. The handheld was mostly an empty shell, as everything necessary was already inside of the Wide Boy cartridge. Obviously, if this was going to be used for testing games, it would have made sense to be able to use the actual controls of the hardware the game was being made for. As you may have guessed, nowadays the Wide Boy is a valuable and sought-after item by collectors. With the release of the much cheaper and more available Game Boy player, there was no longer any need for it. And as time went on, one way or another, purchased units of the Wide Boy 64 found their way into the second-hand market. As for their value, it's difficult for me to give an exact number. Prices for them are all over the place, most of which seem to be much lower than what a new one cost back in the day. That's not too surprising to me, as it's not something that's really valued for its functionality. After all, the Game Boy player does the same things and is much easier to get a hold of. No, the Wide Boy's worth comes from its status as a forgotten and obscure novelty. And well, there's not too much more for me to say on the subject. I was hoping to be able to find some accounts from those that worked with it hands-on. I'm curious to know about how it was handled in both the development and gaming press environments, and the process behind it being used to capture footage for TV commercials, assuming I'm correct with that idea. Given that the Wide Boy isn't a very commonly known piece of hardware, I can't really say that there's a whole treasure trove of info available. So that's why I'm gonna ask you, viewers. Have you ever dealt with one of these things yourself? Maybe you've bought or sold some in the past. Maybe you once worked somewhere that had one. If you've got info that I haven't covered here, tell us all down below in the comments. And with that, I hope y'all enjoyed. See y'all next time.